You should say anything we didn't cover, you should put in the comments below.
Oh, wait, I'll cut that out and I'll put that in.
Okay.
Just put it in there.
I'm so bossy.
Hey guys, welcome to Inside Comics with George Michail. Today, my guest is Chris Cam. Chris, thanks for being on the show.
Hey George, nice to see you again.
Really quick, if you guys like this kind of content, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell a friend about it. So Chris, you are my co-writer on Cover Darkness, and our book is available to order. It's in Previews Magazine right now. So everyone out there, go and ask your local comic book store to bring in Cover Darkness. And we'll talk more about that book in a minute, but let's get into how to write a comic book. A lot of people ask me, how do you do it? Where do I start? How do I get going on this? And I thought, who better to ask than my co-writer? So Chris, how do you go about writing a comic book?
You know what? I think it's going to be different for everyone. I think that's the first thing to say. And our route to success with creating a comic book from A to Z might not be everybody else's, but people can learn from what we've done and take what would work for them and adapt it for themselves. So I think for us, the first thing was that we are both lovers of comics and we wanted to create something together. Having to do with our passion. And you love horror, I love monsters, and we kind of put those two ideas together. And what we did from there is we worked out a plan and a general plot. We didn't go down and work it down to the fine details, but what we started with was a general idea of what was going to happen in our story, what world we were creating. And so we created some general monsters we wanted our heroes to run into, and we created our heroes. And then we decided what was the big obstacle that's going to get in the way of those heroes. So really figuring out what we were going to write worked for us at the very beginning. And so we kind of sat down, and do you remember we were camping and you had brought out a poster board and your Post-it notes, and we just did general outlining of the first six issues, the second set of 6 issues, and then the third set of 6 issues. So our 3 story arcs that we wanted to write. And we just kind of did a general outline of what we were going to write. And then we looked at each other, and you're like, I have a great mummy story I want to tell. And I was like, I have an amazing Frankenstein story that's just, I need to tell it. And the next thing is we went and actually started writing, because often some people will get stopped at the roadblock of, they have a really great idea. Where do you go from there? And we just started writing it down. And you and I both had very different approaches. Do you remember? I would handwrite every single thing I wrote, and you would type up into, Messenger, every plot that you had. And we were like, okay, this isn't working for either one of us. We had to find a middle ground. And that really speaks to every person is going to come to it from a different place. And so we kind of wrote down what we were thinking, exchanged stories, and then just gave each other feedback. And that feedback, I think, was really crucial to our success, because I took what you had said, Frankenstein's awesome. Let's, what if we added this? And I was like, oh my God, I can run with that 100 different ways. And we ran with the Frankenstein story. We ran with the mummy story. And I think if you think of our Dracula story, our Orlok story, how we didn't know what we wanted to write. So we sat down at my kitchen table. Do you remember that? And I'm like, well, I have the idea of a vampire just like desiccated in a graveyard, and then some grave diggers and grave robbers coming in. You're like, oh, that inspires me to go somewhere with it. Do you remember that? And so I think really riffing our ideas together worked well for you and I, and then just writing it down and going back and forth, that really worked for us.
So I think first thing when you're thinking of starting a comic book, you need to look at whether or not this idea has enough merit, because creating a comic book is a huge endeavor. It's massive. It's very time consuming. It costs money if you're not a skilled artist to be able to draw your pictures yourself. You have to hire someone to do that. And so sometimes I'll have a dream, and I'll wake up in the morning and I'll tell my wife about it. And she's like, that sounds pretty cool. You gonna make a comic book about that? And I'll be like, no, it was a neat idea, but it's not like enough to build a whole story off of it. And you have to be passionate about that story too, right? Like really, really passionate, because this thing can take years. It can be years of your life that you're working towards building something, and you really have to be committed. Actually, I was offered to have. I pitched a concept for a property, and I pitched it, and like a licensed property. And the license holder came back and said, no, we don't feel like this is right for our property. But the publisher came back and said, this is a cool story. Why don't you build that out yourself and we'll publish that? And I didn't do it because I wasn't as connected to just creating this story. I know how much work it takes to make a comic book. So I passed on it, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to shelve that idea because I'm not invested enough to pursue it any further at this point anyways. So yeah, really make sure you're invested in your work. And then when you start out on it, you touched on the plotting. So I think the first thing we got to talk about is like creating your characters, because that's how you build your plot too, right? Is who are these people and where do we want to take them?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's where we started with who are our heroes and who are the villains, essentially. So who's the hero? Who are they going against? Protagonist, antagonist, all of those things are things that you want to break down for yourself so that you know your character's motivations, so that you know what you're going to throw against them, but also to have them be realistic. Because often when we think of a character, they can be one-dimensional, or we have this idea in our head and they're so well developed, and as we write it down, they become more and more fleshed out. And we want that. We want a hero who has flaws. We want a villain who has a good reason for what they're doing. We want a well-developed, well-rounded character, both hero and villain.
You sent me some character building sheets, right, when we were getting started. Do you remember that? And
I do, yeah.
Talking about, what is this character like? What do they don't like? What do they? And not that we necessarily did that for every character, but it is something to keep in mind when you're building your world and you're building your characters. Who are these people? And really have a good sense of who they are. So when you're writing them, their personality comes through you onto the page. And then I know there's resources out there, like if you can just Google comic book scripts and take a look at how they're formatted and understand that, like what is the structure of writing a script, how many panels should be on a page. That's something interesting. I try and keep it to about 6 at the most. I think anything more than that, it gets a little bit it slows down the pace of the read too much, I think.
Well, and a lot of it depends on what's happening on those panels, because often I'll stick 3 to 4 tends to be my general range. But if it's a powerful page, then we're going to make that a splash page. If it's something with tons of little actions that we want to communicate it, then that's going to be a 6-panel page. And so you really have to break down your action and keep your story moving. And part of that is the size of your panels and the layout of your panels. And I find that our artist helps us with that a lot.
For sure. Yeah, that's one thing that we did early on. That we've changed as we've been writing is we used to really describe everything that we wanted the artist to do, right down to where we want that panel on the page, okay, on the top corner or whatever. And we used to really give like a lot of notes as far as like the angle of like how we want the camera positioned for them to draw it. And as we've gone along, we've backed off of that much control and handed things over, because we've been working with our artist, MJ Hiblin, on Cover Darkness now for 3 years. And as we get more and more comfortable with each other, we have more faith and more trust to just hand it over to him. So we've stopped doing as much of the description as we used to.
Well, and I think that it worked really well for us in the beginning as we laid out our expectation and we were very clear with Mark what we wanted. And that helped him as well as the artist, because we were so clear, as opposed to having an expectation, not laying that out and then being disappointed with what we got. We kind of over explained our expectations. And then he was really good about coming back and sending us ideas and coming off panel. Like, he's an amazing artist in that he can just really bring that action alive and come off panel and bring it to life in his own format. And he's really come to shine in the last 10 years doing that. And he's an amazing artist that can run with that. At issue 10 that we're at now, we give very little panel layout direction at all.
Yeah. So let's see. So we've got choose your story, make sure it's strong and that you're passionate about it. Know your characters, right? Figure out who they are and so that they have a consistent voice. Plot your book. We do a lot of work in that department of really planning and knowing where we're going. Know where you're going. And sometimes we don't plan like everything to the detail, but we know that we want this image, right? We're like, I have an image for issue like 18 that we're, still, a year or two away from making. I know I want to get to that image. And so how do we get there? And having that vision where, and the follow through to kind of deliver step by step.
Well, and I think that kind of having that vision, sharing that vision, but being broad enough that we can work ideas in as we go. And I think we've kind of kept it tight enough that we can keep on track with the story that we're trying to tell. But we've also kept the general outline broad enough that we can work in some really cool steps along the way that have surprised even us, some of the characters and actions and different things that have come up throughout the plot, throughout the story. So I've really enjoyed that we know the story arc overall. We know the 3 sub-story arcs that are going to get us to the final. And then we're just really loving the world. I think just expanding on what you said, you have to love the product because we're 3 years in. So we have been passionate and talking about monsters and this story and these characters for 3 years, and foreseeable for the next 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to still be talking about these characters. So just expanding upon that, you have to really love what you're doing. If you're not liking it or if something about it isn't sitting right, you got to get to the point that you can be passionate about it for years on years upon years.
Yeah. And another thing as far as like the plotting and in connection with characters is you have to take your characters on an emotional journey. All right. It's not just a physical, where are they going? What are they doing? Who are they fighting? It's how are they going to change from the beginning to the end? Because that's what all good stories really talk about is, a personal growth of a character. And you have to have that plotted out as well and really thought like, okay, well, what am I trying to show with this character? How are they evolving? And then implement that in visual ways too, right? Because it's not just all dialogue, because comic books is a visual medium. So you need to have their changes not just happening by them thinking and thought balloons or them talking with another person. You actually have to have physical action connected to their change.
Well, and I think that an important point, just building on that, is you have to have a character story in an issue as well as within your story arc. So when you do a comic, you're breaking it into 6 short stories. In our case, we've done 6 stories. So we have to have a character action and idea and process through those 6 that will drive us through. But something interesting has to keep the reader wanting to come back to your character for each issue as well. And that goes to the emotional, the moving the plot itself forward through character growth, dynamic interactions with other characters. It kind of builds upon all of that. And I think you have to work in that growth in different ways, but you also have to pace it and throughout your story arc as a whole.
Yeah, that's another thing too, is the pacing, is to think about what are those big plot points in your story and then space them out, right? Because you need to have something happen. And that's one thing that I love about our book, Cover of Darkness, available now, or go into a comic book store and ask them to bring it in for you. But what we've done is in our first 5 issues, each issue has a self-contained monster origin story. And then the other half of the comic is our family's journey, and they're on a collision course with those monsters. So having something happen in each issue was really important to me as a reader, because I hate it when I buy a comic book and all it is building and building and building and building to that next event. And it's like, come on, guys, like, you got my $4. Give me something good this month right now. And So that's what we've done with these monster origin stories. You get it's not quite a short story. It's 11 pages. It's a decent amount of comic book on average in each issue, but you get like a full monster story in each issue, which is I love this format that we've created or used.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the fact that it's half of each of the first 5 comics, you really get to know the motivations of our villains. You really get to see where the monsters are coming from and why they are the way that they are within our series. So it's really nice because you get half of the story dedicated to seeing a side that you don't see as much of normally. Normally you see the hero's journey a lot, but you don't quite see the development or the process behind the monster as much. And so it was a lot of fun working that in and seeing that side of it. And one of my favorite things to ask people when we're at cons is, who's your favorite monster, when they're coming back and telling us what they loved. And I think we hit it pretty good on the nail on the head, because I think I've had pretty much everybody say, I love the werewolves, I love Orlok, I love the mummy. You know, they all have their own favorite villain. And I think that's because we were able to give the reader something they can relate to, a villain that they're like, I like this villain. This is somebody that, you know, I can get behind as a villain.
And that's something that we did on purpose too, when we were creating Cover of Darkness, was to choose characters that were in the public domain that people love already, because we have that kind of inherent value of, you know, people that love monsters, that love horror, want more of that. And so here we are, we're offering them more of something they already love. And that's something to consider when you're creating your own comic book out there, and you're thinking, well, how am I going to get people into this? And that's not the only option, but consider what people like. And if you're creating an original character, be able to compare it to something. So, you know, if it's a superhero, you can say, okay, he's like this character or that character, and just so that you can relate it to them a bit more, you know, because once you make your book, you have to go out and sell it. And we'll talk about that in the next episode, how to get your comic book published. But that's one thing to consider too, is like, how am I going to market this thing? Because it can be fine to write a story that you're passionate about, that have cool characters, that have a good story arc. But if it's not something that's going to be interesting to a comic book buyer, that might be a problem, because you have to sell this book, and slow-moving dramas in comic book format can be a tough sell.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that we do as an example is we talk about the monsters, but to give people an idea of our family setting, we compare it to Game of Thrones. And so a lot of people are familiar with it because of the HBO miniseries that came out recently. So we can say it's like the family of Game of Thrones, in that we take a family, we brutally tear them apart, and they each go on their own journey. And so that's something relatable that the reader can be like, oh, okay, well, I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but I get the concept that you're speaking of. Or, you know, it's set in a medieval world like Game of Thrones, and they're like, oh, okay, well, that I can understand. So I think that's something that as you're writing, you want to think, what is the relatability of it? How are you going to compare it for somebody? And as you said, that's the sales side of it. But as you're writing it, it's also something that you can be thinking of and diving deep into, is, where am I going? Go your own unique place, go your own unique story. But what is the reader base that you're looking for?
So we've touched upon choosing a story that you're really passionate about, creating characters that you know well and that you can hear their voice, plot out their character arcs and the plot as far as like, what are they going to be doing, where are they going to be going, those sorts of things as well. Have lots of groundwork done before you actually start down and sit down writing. You can go out and reference what a script looks like. Do you have any last thoughts on what someone should do when they want to start writing a comic book?
I think the next biggest thing that we should touch on is just do it. Get the words down on paper, on Messenger, on email. Just type it, get it down, because I think that's probably the biggest obstacle, is just start writing and just go with it, and don't stop until you've told the story that you want to have told. Go back and edit it, and just keep doing it again and again until it's the story that you want to be out there. Just do it.
Okay, so Crystal, our series, Cover of Darkness, is available to order into your local comic book store right now. It's in Previews Magazine.
Yeah.
can you give a quick elevator pitch of the book? What
Yeah,
is
do you like
Cover
monsters,
Darkness?
man? I love monsters. So our story is full of monsters. If you go into a medieval world, think kind of Game of Thrones, you have a family. We brutally tear them apart and put them on a collision course with all of the best monsters that you can think of. We've got werewolves, we've got gorillas, we've got Frankenstein. If you think of a badass monster, we have put them in our book. So this family desperately, all they want is to get back together. Alas, we're not so kind to this family, and we just put them on a brutal collision course with these monsters. Every time they try and reunite and you think that there's hope, there's one more monster they just got to face. And so it's a fun adventure that's a little bit horror, so not for our very young readers at this point in time, but I think that anybody 16 and up, this is the story if you want that scary monster family. All of that's mixed in there.
Oh, I would even say 13 and up. Come on, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, one thing I do love about our series is that we've reimagined those monsters too. So it's not your same old take on Frankenstein. In our version, he's from Atlantis and he's resurrected by his widow. So there's new twists on these things. Our werewolves are Vikings. So lots of fun stuff. Yeah, so everyone out there, go check out Cover Darkness. Ask your local comic book store to bring it in for you. It's from Source Point Press. Until next time. We're going to do another episode. So tune in next week. And Crystal and I are going to talk about how to get your book published. So stick around for that. See you next time, guys. Peace.
Awesome.